the Lord. When we read the scriptures, when we hear different readings at Mass, we can sometimes bring our own views of the world and our own views of language to the scriptures. But if we're being faithful to the scriptures, the first thing we should do is try to read it and understanding it from the perspective of the human writer who wrote it at that time, and then starting to try to understand it from God's perspective, as opposed to necessarily imposing our own personal perspective upon the scriptures. This first reading today, I know when it's read by certain people, really lifts their blood pressure, I would say. It causes a lot of upheaval for certain people. I don't know if some of you have had similar experiences talking to people who think this is just so outdated language, this is just such terrible. How is it that we're talking about wives being obedient to their husbands and all of this that goes on from some of the words of this first reading today from St. Paul to the Ephesians. We need to get into the understanding of what was St. Paul writing in that time. What was the whole context of what he's writing about? And if we read and listen to this whole passage, we realise that St. Paul's not talking about marriages, and he makes that very clear. And from God's perspective, what's coming through here is not about structure within marriage. It's primarily about a structure for the church. And the church sometimes is referred to as the bride of Christ. That any action that we do should help us, should be done with a thought to Christ. And hopefully within the context of a loving union, that neither person, husband or wife, should be acting that's going to be completely in isolation from the other. The whole concept of a Christian marriage is that you create a covenant, a unity between husband and wife, which is a beautiful thing. Sometimes the language of this reading can cause upheaval, especially if those who came from a perspective maybe in the 1960s, 1970s, where women's rights became more talked about, and appropriately as well. But that's not what this reading is talking about. It's talking about that union. And the church exists because it's connected with Jesus Christ. And when we disconnect Jesus and when we sort of start to think so inwardly that we forget that we exist because of Jesus, everything that we do connects to Jesus. Once we start to live in a disconnected way, there is a real disharmony. And you can see that, I'm sure many of us can recognise that within marriages as well. If a husband is not thinking about what God's plan is for the marriage and trying to actually bring about the work of God, that love of God, marriage is going to be on rocky terms. It's going to be in a rocky place. And the same with the wife. The wife is not listening attentively to what the husband, who's trying to listen to what the work of God is, and listen and to do God's will, it's going to be a mess. So let's pray for the church. We'll pray that we will be obedient to Christ, that we will listen attentively to the work of Christ. And that when we read the scriptures, let's not just bring our own perspective, our initial perspective. Let's search for the perspective of what the passage is actually trying to tell us from the original writer, the human writer, this context, St. Paul, the context, the Ephesians, and God as the writer as well, the divine author. Those should come to our minds before we start then imposing, thinking, oh, this word should say this in my context now, and this brings a certain level of conflict for ourselves. Let's give way to one another in obedience to Christ. This is what St. Paul wrote to the Ephesians. Let us be obedient to the words of Jesus Christ to allow God's will to be present in our church, in our families, in our world today.